Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. Yesterday we told you about China's economic slowdown and how it will hurt the whole world. Today we want to talk about how the rest of the world is faring, especially India. Look at the recent headlines. Prime Minister Modi is in Europe to push the case for a trade deal. Today he participated in the India-Nordic Summit. He talked about the blue economy, clean energy, space, healthcare and a whole host of things. Earlier this week, India announced its 100th unicorn, a major milestone in the country's growth story. This morning, India's biggest IPO was launched. LIC shares open for subscription. The Government of India plans to raise 21,000 crore rupees by diluting its stake in LIC. In the past few months, the Indian economy bounced back from the pandemic. India saw one of the world's fastest growth rates. At the same time, India is grappling with rising costs. Just like most developing economies, inflation remains a problem. India is the world's largest importer of edible oils like palm and soy. India also imports more than 80% of its crude oil. All of those prices are high thanks to the war in Ukraine. So what do we make of these headlines? Where is the economy heading? Today, the Central Bank of India made an announcement. Markets reacted. What does all of this mean for you? On Gravitas tonight, we'll break down the numbers and the trends to give you the big picture. Economics is a strange discipline. Few people understand it, but everyone feels the effects of it. When you go to the gas station or when you visit the local grocer, chances are you have sensed something is off. Most notably, the prices. Things are getting more expensive globally. Your fuel, your cooking oil, your vegetables, every commodity is becoming more expensive. The question is why? One reason is the war in Ukraine. Global supply chains are under threat. And when that happens, prices go up. But that's not the only reason. You see, the global economy is at an inflection point. People are vaccinated, Wuhan virus cases are down, lockdowns have disappeared. So the world is looking at the next phase, the phase of economic recovery. But before that, they have to deal with the past, the period between 2020, and now. What was the highlight of that period? Massive spending. Every country was announcing stimulus packages. And they had two objectives. One, cover the pandemic-related expenditure like masks, PPE kits, vaccines, and all sorts of things. And two, keep the economy afloat. The private sector stopped investing during the pandemic years, so someone had to keep spending money, and that someone was the government. How much money are we talking about? The G7 alone spent $8 trillion. India announced packages worth $300 billion. All of this money flooded into our economy. At that time, it was needed because money was not the priority, saving lives was. But in economics, like in life, actions have consequences. What happens when you flood the economy with money, when you spend too much? Prices begin to rise. In other words, inflation. That's what happens. And that's what's happening right now. Take a look at this table. In Argentina, inflation is at 52%. In Brazil, 11%. Canada, 5.7%, the highest in 31 years. In France, it is 5.1%, their highest level since December 1985. India too is feeling the pinch. Inflation here is at 6.95%, the highest level since 2020. In Australia, it is 5.1%, which is the worst level since the year 2001. Long story short, prices are rising in every continent, and the result is this. Central banks are stepping in to raise interest rates. India did that today. The Reserve Bank of India hiked interest rates by 40 basis points. The new lending rate is 4.4%. It was the first policy hike in almost 4 years. What does this mean for you? In simple words, it means less money to spend. When interest rates rise, loans become more expensive. Your monthly payments go up, and this causes a chain reaction. People will spend less, and gradually inflation will ease. India is not the only country doing this. Australia did the same on Tuesday. The US Federal Reserve is planning to do it tonight. Europe, Canada, England, all of these central banks are planning to hike interest rates, basically slow down spending. By how much? The G7 is shrinking its balance sheet by $410 billion. To put that number in perspective, last year they added 2.8 trillion. This year they're slashing $410 billion. It is a complete turnaround for the world economy. The last 2 years were about mindless spending. The next 2 or more could be about tight controls. Which brings us to the big question. What should you be doing with your money? Should you spend it, save it, or invest it? What's the best option right now? Let's focus on India for the moment. Sensex dropped 1,300 points today. Nifty fell 2%. Is the worst over? Or could the markets fall even more? Depends on what the US Federal Reserve does. Foreign investors are waiting for their decision, the US Federal Reserve, and rumor is the Fed will hike interest rates by 50 basis points, their largest hike since the year 2000. And if that happens, foreign investors will flock to America. Where will they flock from? Possibly Asian markets. Investors could pull out of Asian markets and dump their money in the US, and if that happens, the markets may fall further. So hold off on any immediate stock buys. That's what experts say. Where does all of this leave our economic recovery then? In a limbo. Because things are hard to predict right now. Job openings in the US are at a record high. Eurozone unemployment hit a historic low. Yet growth is sluggish. America's GDP contracted 1.4% in the last quarter. 2 quarters of negative growth is recession. That's how precarious things are. Which explains why the central banks have finally intervened. Some experts say it's already too late, that spending should have been tightened earlier. Others say better late than never. Either way, the top priority seems to be curbing inflation right now to control spending. And frankly, it makes sense. Just look at what's happening in Sri Lanka. Mindless expenditure has left them broke. So what we need at the moment is fiscal prudence. Imagine your economy was a car. For the last 2 years, this car has been running non-stop, and that too at top speed. So now it's time to give it a rest. Maybe open the hood and let the engine cool off. As for economic growth, it can be handled in the long run. Just one question. What will that long run look like? Russia's war is going nowhere. China's lockdowns are getting worse. If only there was normalcy, the economy could recover. But right now, some leaders seem to be following the words of John Keynes. In the long run, we are all dead. In another part of the planet, the United States is all set to ban abortion. We told you about this yesterday. Cynics say it's not a ban, it's a choice. A choice that has been given to American states, not to American women. And that is a fundamental problem. This choice should be a woman's and a woman's only. Whether to continue a pregnancy or to abort cannot be a state's choice.
It's your body, your choice. Your body, your body.
What do we want? Abortion rights. What do we want? Abortion rights. Why do we want them? Yeah. Pro-choice, that's a lie. Babies never choose to die.
But the US Supreme Court seems to disagree. Its leaked ruling cites ancient history in defense. This leaked ruling, the draft that we told you about yesterday, says that since the founders of the US Constitution did not mention the right to abortion, that right cannot be guaranteed by the federal administration. FYI, the American Constitution was first signed in the year 1787, and of the 55 delegates, at least 15 had refused to sign the document. Do you know why? They objected to the lack of a Bill of Rights, human rights. My point is, the American Constitution, like every other constitution, was not foolproof then. And it is not perfect now. But now is a chance for America to change, to codify abortion rights. The onus is on the 46th President of the United States of America, President Joe Biden, a man who not too long ago was anti-abortion. Today, he's treading carefully.
Look, the idea that it concerns me a great deal that we're going to, after 50 years, decide a woman does not have a right to choose within the limits of the Supreme Court decision in Casey, number one. But even more, equally as profound is the rationale used. And it would mean that every other decision relating to the notion of privacy is thrown into question.
Women should have the right to choose, and that goes without saying. But what exactly is the President of the United States doing to ensure that women of his country have the right to choose? Joe Biden has asked the Congress to codify Roe versus Wade. What does that mean? Roe versus Wade is a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. This ruling guarantees the right to abortion. Now, Biden is telling the U.S. Congress to turn it into a federal law, codify it. But at the same time, Biden has refused to end filibuster. What is filibuster? A way to prolong the proceedings of the House so that a bill is not passed or a decision is not taken. Basically, it's a roadblock. So any conservative senator can choose to delay the proceedings of the bill by rambling on and on. The bill will be delayed, and by then, the Supreme Court of the United States will serve women's rights on a platter to American states. Joe Biden says if that does happen, it will be a quote-unquote fundamental shift in American jurisprudence.
Well, you know, if this decision holds, it's really quite a radical decision. And again, the underlying premise, and again, I've not had a chance to thoroughly go into the report, the decision. But it basically says all the decisions relating to your private life, who you marry, whether or not you decide to conceive a child or not, whether or not you can have an abortion, a range of other decisions, whether or not how you raise your child. What does this do? Does this mean that in Florida they can decide they're going to pass a law saying that same-sex marriage is not permissible? It's against the law in Florida? So there's a whole, it's a fundamental shift in American jurisprudence.
How far is he willing to go to stop this from happening? Joe Biden is America's second Catholic president. His political career started in the year 1973, the same year as Roe versus Wade. Back then, Biden, the senator, had opposed abortion. He said the Supreme Court had gone, quote-unquote, too far in legalizing abortion across America. The following year, Biden gave an interview. He said that a woman should not, and I repeat, a woman should not have the quote-unquote sole right to say what should happen to her body. A woman should not have the sole right to say what should happen to her body. This is Joe Biden. Well, who else should then? By 2012, Biden had become less tone deaf. He was running for the vice presidential office. Listen to what he said during a debate.
I accept my church's position on abortion as what we call de fide doctrine. Life begins at conception. That's the church's judgment. I accept it in my personal life. But I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians and Muslims and Jews. And I just refuse to impose that on others, unlike...
Well, now is Biden's time to fight this imposition. Biden's presidential campaign was pro-abortion, pro-reproductive rights. He said he has the most progressive record for anyone running for president. He promised to be a president who is great for women's rights. Well, now is his test. When human rights were compromised in Xinjiang, China, President Biden slapped sanctions. When reports of war crimes emerged from Ukraine, President Biden slapped sanctions. Now the Supreme Court of America is all set to violate the rights of more than 167 million women living in the U.S. Does the Commander-in-Chief of Human Rights plan to go beyond lip service? Or is he looking to score brownie points from this verdict? Why do I say this? Because he stands to gain politically from this order. The abortion ruling is being touted as the most polarizing verdict in recent history. This ruling like we've been telling you, is due late June or early July, and that's just in time for the November midterm elections. A ruling against abortion will benefit the Democrats. Estimates say more than 60% of Americans support the right to abortion. A ban on abortion will most likely nudge them to vote for Democrats. So that's the politics that Biden will be keeping in mind. A ban on abortion helps his party. But it also hammers his promises and his presidency. This catch-22 is a test for Joe Biden, who for decades dreamt of being president. America remembers Ronald Reagan as the anti-abortion president, the man who launched the most devastating attack on abortion rights. This is Biden's chance to be remembered as the president who left his personal leanings aside, who left his church teachings aside, the president who ignored political calculations to do what is right. Will Joe Biden pass this test? Or will he become party to this human rights violation in America? We'll not stop reporting on this story. It's day 3 of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Europe trip. Today he was in Denmark. He participated in a summit with Nordic states. Now this includes 5 countries, 5 Nordic countries: Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Iceland and Norway. And this is important because together the Nordic countries are an economic powerhouse. Their combined GDP is $1.8 trillion. Also, apart from from India, the US is the only country with which the Nordic 5 engages at a summit level. So this was an important meeting. Prime Minister Modi invited them to be part of India's growth story. This summit was all about laying the groundwork, about investing for the future. Modi's next stop is all about the opposite, about reaping the benefits from an old relationship. I'm talking about Paris. He's reached there. He will meet French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, this meeting is probably the most important engagement of this trip. I'll tell you why. A, because Macron is fresh off his re-election. Modi is the first head of state to meet him after his victory. That symbolism counts for something. And Paris is pulling out all the stops. They have prepared a vegetarian spread for the Indian delegation. I'm sure that does not happen every day at the LSE Palace. B, the prospects of this relationship are massive. Trade, defense, security, climate change, on most global issues, India and France are on the same page. And now is the right time to build on that because both leaders have the political capital to do so. Prime Minister Modi has 2 years left in his term. Macron is locked in for another 5 years. Plus, both of them enjoy great personal chemistry. The key is to make the most of this opportunity to build a resilient, all-weather relationship. The ingredients are all there. We have identified 4 things that could define the India-France relationship. Number 1 is defense. France is India's second largest weapons supplier. First is Russia, second is France. Some big-ticket deals have already been signed. Chief among them, of course, is the Rafale deal. The last of the 36 jets are being readied for delivery. And it seems India wants more. Pretty soon, aircraft carrier INS Vikrant will be handed over to the Indian Navy. Now, carriers need fighter jets. And Dassault is in talks to sell 26 Rafale M fighters to the Indian Navy. France is a unique supplier for India. That's because they do not do business with India's rivals. Russia, supplies weapons to China. America supplies weapons to Pakistan. And both countries are India's rivals. But France only deals with India. That's what makes it unique. Factor number 2, cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Macron has ambitious goals in the region. He's banking on India's support to achieve them. In February, Paris hosted a special Indo-Pacific forum. Now remember the timing. February. This was in the middle of Russia's build-up near Ukraine, yet France managed to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Also, Paris has direct stakes in the region. I'm talking about the Reunion Islands. The rest of Europe is isolated from the Indo-Pacific. France is not. It is effectively an Indian Ocean power. Which brings us to factor number 3. France is still seething from the AUKUS snub. Many in Paris see the AUKUS as an Anglosphere club. America, Australia, Britain. 3 English-speaking countries doing whatever they want. India is not part of that club. New Delhi has consistently called for a free and open Indo-Pacific, sort of like a multilateral domain, and that fits well with Macron's worldview, which is factor number 4. Emmanuel Macron does not see himself as just the leader of France. He wants to be the leader of Europe. He wants Europe to step out of America's shadows. And if that happens, France could be India's gateway to Europe. Because let's face it, Paris is perfectly placed to do that. Germany has the power, yes, but not the will. So uniting Europe will be Macron's job. Plus, he's a lot easier to deal with. Take Russia's war, for instance. Everybody has been lecturing India on what to do. America, Britain, Denmark, Germany, everyone is asking India to do something or the other. Guess who isn't? France. Now that may change today in the meeting, but so far France has been understanding of India's position. Now these are 4 areas of bilateral cooperation, things that France and India can agree on. Beyond these, there are some areas of unrealized potential. 2 things stand out: bilateral trade and China. France makes up only 1.4% of India's total trade. And the trajectory is not good. India's exports to France are down 23%. French exports to India are down 20%. You could blame the pandemic, but both countries must work to expand bilateral trade, because countries that trade together stay together. The second issue is China. I know France has been focusing on the Indo-Pacific, but their language is problematic. Macron sees a competitor in China, not a barbaric state that could upend the world order. And this is where India can play an important role. Perhaps seek more French engagement in the Indo-Pacific, or convince Paris about China's threat. Like I said, all the ingredients are there. No colonial baggage, great leader-to-leader chemistry, and agreement on most global issues. So today's joint statement will be one to watch out for. Well, Europe is struggling to find the same level of unity over Russia. Since the beginning of the war, the bloc has failed to present a united front. No matter what they say, the threats from Moscow are growing. The latest one comes from a state broadcaster. It has issued this warning to the United Kingdom and Ireland: stop support to Ukraine or face a nuclear tsunami. That is the threat. Here's a report.
Другой вариант – погрузить Британию в морскую пучину, российский подводный робот-беспилотник.
It was a brazen threat from one of Russia's top propagandists. Last Sunday, a Russian state TV presenter issued a chilling warning.
Нет никакого способа остановить этот подводный дрон.
The threat came with a simulation. A missile would launch from a Russian submarine. The broadcaster claimed it would raise a nuclear tsunami.
Такой водяной шквал является еще и носителем экстремальных доз радиации.
One that will turn the UK into a radioactive desert and destroy Ireland. Who is the man making these threats? His name is Dmitry Kiselyov. Many consider him to be Russia's chief spin doctor. Kiselyov has a reputation for such extravagant threats. In 2014, he issued similar threats to America. Kiselyov claimed that Russia could turn the United States into radioactive ash. In the same broadcast, he trained his guns on Barack Obama, the then president of the United States. He suggested Obama's hair is graying because of fears about Russia's nuclear arsenal. Thankfully, those threats didn't materialize.
Боевая тревога, ракетная атака, ракетное оружие к бою.
But how serious is Russia about attacking the British Isles? Soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin escalated the risk of a nuclear face-off. The Russian president put his nuclear deterrent forces on alert. Russia's foreign minister says no one should underestimate the risk.
Really, the risks are really considerable, and I would not want to elevate those risks artificially. Many would like that. The danger is serious, real, and we must not underestimate it.
The United Kingdom is now downplaying the Russian threats. Last week, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said he did not expect Russia to use tactical weapons. Ireland has strongly condemned the threats from Moscow. It has called the Russian television broadcast a very sinister, intimidatory type tactic by the Russian Federation. The European Union too has taken notice. It now wants to ban 3 Russian-owned state broadcasters. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
We have more news from Europe. The Brits are electing They're municipal councils. These are local elections, but they're being seen as a referendum on Boris Johnson. Voters will have their say on the Partygate scandal. So far, the British Prime Minister has managed to shake off all criticism, but this election could turn things around. And going by one survey, his Conservative Party is staring at an embarrassing defeat, perhaps their worst ever. Here's a report.
This is an election that could define the future of British politics. Voters across the United Kingdom are electing their local representatives. Over 4,000 council seats are up for grabs. And it is not looking good for Boris Johnson. His Conservative Party could lose over 500 seats. A survey shows the Labour Party winning 3,500 seats, a gain of 800. The Tories could be reduced to less than 980 seats. If this projection holds, this could be the worst showing for the Conservatives ever. Ahead of the polling, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried to contain some of the damage. He promised to do something about the rising inflation, but refused to provide any short-term relief.
I totally understand why people are feeling the pressures caused particularly by the cost of energy that's feeding through into food and just about everything else, and you can see it everywhere. So the most important thing, and we do think it'll abate, we do think it'll come down, but I can't give you the answer to that. But we think in the medium term it will certainly come down. But what we need to do, get people through this, just as we got people through COVID, being as compassionate, as ingenious as we can be. Help think of all the ways we can help. Without, we've got to remember that we only have limited resources of taxpayers' money, so we have to be sensible about how we do it.
Johnson's political rival Keir Starmer is attacking him. A few days ago, he got an endorsement of former Prime Minister Tony Blair. The Labour leader stepped out for a final round of campaigning. He hammered the Conservatives over the rising cost of living.
What we need to do, I think, is to focus on the issue in hand, which is the cost of living, because as we go across the region, we go across the country, talking to people on their doorsteps, everybody is talking about the fact they can't pay their bills.
But inflation is just one of the concerns.
It isn't enough to say sorry.
The Partygate scandal is hurting Boris Johnson more.
And we must learn.
The voters are not buying the British Prime Minister's defence. A polling agency conducted a survey. This is what it found. 78% of Britons polled say Johnson lied about the lockdown parties. Conservative candidates themselves admit Boris Johnson could have lost the trust of the voters.
Not at the moment. He's got to rebuild trust. I know he's got to do that. He's got to come up with some way, which I don't put it beyond him. I really don't. That he'll do one of those speeches that he occasionally comes up with.
Johnson did make that speech. Just hours before polling began, he addressed the Ukrainian parliament virtually. He pledged more aid to Ukraine. The opposition has accused him of electioneering. Johnson continues to roll with every punch that is thrown at him. He has faced repeated calls for resignation since the Partygate scandal broke. But Johnson has refused to relent. Now British voters will pronounce their verdict on his record and decide the future of Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
We live in the age of conspiracy theories. The earth is flat, aliens are real, COVID is a hoax. We hear all kinds of conspiracy theories every day, some hilarious, some not so much. Russia's foreign minister is peddling one such theory. He says Hitler was part Jewish. Listen to this.
The Ukrainian president puts forward an argument. What kind of Nazification can we have if I am Jew? If I remember right, I may be wrong, but Hitler also had Jewish origins. So it doesn't mean absolutely anything. For some time we have heard from the wise Jewish people that the biggest anti-Semites were Jewish.
And just to be clear, there is no evidence for what he said. No DNA, no empirical proof, nothing to corroborate this claim. Having said that, this is not a new theory. It's been around since the 1930s. So the question is, where did this scandalous idea come from? It goes back to Hitler's father. He was an illegitimate child. His mother cooked for a Jewish man, but the father, nobody knows. And this led to rumors. What if there was an affair? What if this Jewish man was Hitler's biological grandfather? Now, these rumors were fueled by one more development. Hitler's grandmother was paid a maintenance by this Jewish employer. The money kept coming until Hitler's father came of age. I know it all sounds murky, but there is a logical explanation. All these theories are based on claims by Hitler's lawyer, a certain Hans Frank. Hitler once told Hans the entire story. Apparently, the maintenance was a scheme. Hitler's mother convinced the employer that he was the father. Why? To scheme money from him. Most historians are doubtful about the entire thing. The Jewish employer, the affair, the scheme, all of it. No proof. Nonetheless, the conspiracy gained popularity, especially after Hitler came to power in the 1930s. Remember, this was a period of intense anti-Semitism. So Hitler's rivals played on it. Even today, some people believe the entire story. They say Hitler was shameful of his alleged Jewish roots, and this shame led to the Holocaust. Extremists peddling this theory is one thing. Russia's foreign minister doing it is quite another. Because this claim is not about history. It's about 21st century politics. The reactions are already pouring in, and needless to say, Israel is livid. Their foreign minister says he expects an apology from Russia.
It is an unforgivable, scandalous statement, as you said, and also, of course, a terrible historical mistake, and we expect an apology.
Well, good luck to Israel with that, because Russia is not apologizing. In fact, they're doubling down. Moscow says Israel is supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine. What explains this outrage? Just 1 month back, Putin was hosting Israel's prime minister in Moscow. Israel was being pushed as a negotiator. And now Lavrov says Hitler was Jewish. How exactly did things break down? One theory is that Russia is unhappy with Israel's position. They have opened field hospitals in Ukraine. They've sent humanitarian supplies. Perhaps Moscow was expecting a different role from Israel. Well, even if that was the case, Russia has a weird way of expressing displeasure. Just think about this. No Israeli prime minister can remain neutral after this. Until now, Naftali Bennett had refused to pick sides. And there was a reason for that. Russia controls the airspace in Syria. Without Russian help, Israel cannot strike Iranian proxy targets. So Bennett had a choice, a rather clear choice, Russia or Iran. And like any Israeli leader, he chose to tackle Iran and to go with Russia. But these comments by Lavrov complicate matters. On the one hand, the Iran nuclear talks have broken down again. Reports say the deal is as good as dead. On the other, you have Russia making anti-Semitic statements, basically pushing Israel into a corner. The ball is now in Naftali Bennett's court. Does he stick with neutrality, or does he move closer to the West? Well, we are moving east, talking about Japan now. The war in Ukraine is taking an unlikely toll on Japan. The country's beloved soba noodles are about to become more expensive. The invasion has led to serious supply shortages. Just like the rest of the world, prices of essentials are going up in Japan, and this could force the Japanese to give up on their favorite dish. Here's more.
Ryu Ishihara runs a noodle stand in Tokyo. For nearly a decade, he has sold his noodle bowls at the same price. One of them costs around $2, but Ishihara must take some tough decisions now. The war in Ukraine is taking a toll on his business.
The suppliers did all they could, but this time the situation is so bad, there's no way to avoid raising prices. There are items I'll have to raise by 10 to 15%. From COVID-19 and now with this war, I'm wondering when it will all end. I first thought it would be all over in 6 months, but there's no signs of an end. I'm really worried.
A bowl of noodles is a staple in Japan. One of its key ingredients is buckwheat. It is short in supply. Japan produces only 42% of the buckwheat seeds it needs. The gap is filled by imports. Russia is the top producer of buckwheat. It supplies a third of Japan's buckwheat. There are no restrictions on Russian buckwheat imports yet, but supply disruptions have led to shortages.
Because of the economic sanctions, such as Russia being removed from SWIFT banking system and some shipping companies putting a halt on its cargo ships departing and arriving on Russian ports, there's been a disruption on logistics. As a result, there's been a delay in the arrival of buckwheat seeds to Japan. Russia makes half of the world's production. If we can't import buckwheat seeds from Russia in the future, we will shift our demand to China, which is the second largest buckwheat producer.
Japan needs more than just buckwheat. Russia's invasion is hurting the Japanese economy. It has led to inflation. The yen plunged to a nearly 20-year low against the dollar in April. This has made essential commodities more expensive. Prices of soy sauce, flour, and vegetables have shot up. All this is making the humble bowl of noodles more expensive. At this noodle stand, faithful customers are not ready to give up on their favorite dish. For now, they are not worried about the prospect of higher prices. But even they may have their limits.
It depends on how often I will come, but I hope the price stays around 500 yen.
The war in Ukraine has disrupted the world in more ways than one. It has broken banking systems. Prices of fuel are skyrocketing. Now, global supply chains are under pressure. In this difficult time, many people found solace in their favorite comfort foods. But now an impending food crisis could take those simple pleasures away.
Now let's take a look at what else is making news across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
Russian forces launched a major assault on the Azovstal steel plant in the southern Ukrainian port city of Mariupol as the first convoy of refugees from the plant reached the city of Zaporizhzhia. Russia has banned the entry of Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and several other Japanese officials after Tokyo joined international sanctions against Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. Amid a simmering political crisis, Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa expressed confidence over winning the no-trust vote. Rajapaksa asserted that he has the required support in parliament. China's capital, Beijing, shut dozens of metro stations and bus routes in a bid to stop the spread of COVID-19 as it battles its worst coronavirus flare-up since the early days of the pandemic. India's central bank has hiked key lending rates, citing inflation and geopolitical tensions. The rates have been hiked for the first time since May 2020. In a landmark decision, career networking service LinkedIn agreed to pay $1.8 million in back wages to hundreds of female workers over gender-based pay discrimination. Amid a string of sanctions busting weapons tests, North Korea test-fired a ballistic missile just a week after leader Kim Jong-un vowed to boost Pyongyang's nuclear arsenal at the fastest possible speed. Spain's Valencia city receives highest rainfall in a single day in the month of May since 1871. Heavy rains accompanied by storm and lightning triggered flash floods in the region. Liverpool have reached a third Champions League final in 5 years after completing a 5-2 aggregate victory over Spanish side Villarreal. After conceding twice in the second leg of the tie, Jurgen Klopp's side scored thrice in the second half to keep their quadruple hopes alive. The Memphis Grizzlies have leveled their NBA Western Conference semifinal series against the Golden State Warriors with a narrow 106-101 point win in Game 2. The Eastern Conference, the Boston Celtics, also bounced back against champions Milwaukee Bucks to level the best-of-7 series.
That's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.